Good morning. My thumbprint is not working. That's not a good sign. Okay. Well, here we are. Another Sunday, another sermon in the narrative imperative as we journey through the story of the Bible, which reminded me of a conversation that I had just a few years ago with a friend of mine, asking about the Bible. Now, you may look at this and think, that's an odd way to write that. There should be a "the" in between there, maybe? But that wasn't her question. Her question had more to do with why we even use the Bible, or why is the Bible such an important thing for us if it's so difficult to read? We can't just pick up this book and glean out of it all the wisdom that we probably want. I mean, if that was the case, you wouldn't need me to stand up here and, having gone to seminary and read lots of books and all that interesting stuff, you wouldn't need that. You would be able to just pick it up. But the Bible is so much more complicated than that. Even in my Sunday school class this morning, as we were looking at a Bible passage and a theme throughout the Bible, questions came up. Like, why does it say one thing here and another thing there? You see, I think the Bible is something that we are supposed to wrestle with. It's part of the whole learning plan of the Bible. Now, sometimes we can make it more complicated than we need to, but other times we just wish that it was easy, and then I wonder, if it was too easy, would we even bother? But like I said, the wrestling, I think, is part of what the Bible is about. You know the phrase, the medium is the message. Well, if the medium is this book that is kind of confusing and kind of strange and kind of pushing us to dig deeper, perhaps the message is also that we are called to dig deeper. Because if we look at the story, we notice that God is not about spoon-feeding, micromanaging, or dictating human behavior. Part of what we must learn is this journey that we navigate will be uncertain, and that we have to contextualize. Things were not the same 2,000 years ago as they are today. And so we have to wrestle. And that wrestling, it builds faith, it builds character, it builds humility. Like an athlete practices and trains their body and mind through exercises and disciplines, we must also train our minds and bodies for the life of faith. And so here we do not worship the Bible, but we meditate on it. We wrestle with it. And this takes a lifetime. Or, like I shared this morning with my Sunday school class, we can maybe find some little shortcuts along the way, learning from the wisdom of others, studying Scripture intentionally. But even when we do that, we must approach the Bible with flexibility. For what we read in one book of the Bible might be contradicted or seem completely opposite in another. For instance, when it says, "Blessed are the poor," in one book, and in another it says, "Blessed are you who have much." And so we must wrestle. But I think one of the most important things that we must do with the Bible is to read it in community. Reading the Bible in isolation produces a God that looks very much like ourselves. But if we read in community, we share the struggles and the stories and the experience of God with one another. Our community can be shaped by the true God. So when it comes to reading the Bible today, I think these stories can be contextualized in the first century when Jesus walked the earth, and we kind of let ourselves off the hook a little too easily. Even scholars can lead us astray, or maybe especially scholars can lead us astray in stories like this, where we hear a parable of the tenants, or the wicked tenants, and we think, oh, this was just a story about back then. Because the landowner was God, and the vineyard was the people of God, and the tenants are the religious leaders around them. The servants were the prophets that came in the Old Testament, and the son in the story was Jesus. Sure, that's a great interpretation, and in fact, that's the interpretation that Jesus meant for the people there to receive, and they did. But if we only think of it as something in the past, we bypass the power of this parable to challenge us. And in the second part, when Jesus is asked about paying the imperial tax, we could reduce this to our responsibility to pay taxes in this country. But this would be a very surface level reading. While it's true that we probably should pay our taxes, we would probably get in trouble if we didn't, it ignores the full meaning that is hidden in plain sight in this passage. So let's read it a little closer. Let's see if we can get beyond these surface level readings. Let's ask good questions, not closed-ended questions that shut down conversation, those ones that just end with a yes or a no, but open-ended questions that require a longer answer to keep the conversation going. And what better than to go with the question that was asked by one of the best question askers of all time. Jesus was a great question asker. He often responded to questions, especially those that were meant to trap him, with more questions. So Jesus, when asked if it is lawful to pay taxes or not, he asked them a question. Now, of course, the Romans would say, of course you should pay your taxes, pay them on time, pay them well. But what Jesus was being asked was whether God required the people to pay taxes. Of course, they were trying to trick him or trap him, because there's no explicit mention in any of the Torah or the prophets, the Hebrew Bible. So what were they getting at? So like a coin, Jesus flips it around. He asked them to bring forth a coin and said, whose head is on this and whose title? They give the answer as expected, the emperor's. So then Jesus responds with, give to the emperor the things that are the emperor's, and to God the things that are God's. But there's something missing there that we're supposed to pick up on. How do we know what belongs to God? Well, I think we should use the same criteria as was used on the coin. Whose head is on it, and whose title? The word that we find here, head, is maybe not actually the best translation. The word here in Greek is icon, which you probably would think of as like the icon of a phone on your cell phone that looks nothing like that. But it's something that conveys a meaning to us. We know what it means because of what it looks like. Now, this word, icon, shows up in a very important place in the scriptures. If we look back to the Greek translation of Genesis, when God is creating all of humanity in Adam and Eve, he says, let us make humanity in our icon. So what carries the icon of God? We do. And the title on the coin, or the title as it is used in Scripture, in Isaiah 44, the remnant of God's people will have their names written, or the Lord's name written upon their hand. Kind of like the toys in Toy Story with Andy's name written on their foot. We have God's name written upon us. We may not be able to see it with our ordinary eyes, but as we live, as we walk with God, that name appears. Perhaps it's kind of like the old Amish saying of when asked, do you think I'm a Christian? Or when they ask if they're a Christian, they respond with, ask my neighbor. They see God in us. So what I think this is saying is, to what belongs to God, which bears God's icon and name, it is us. Which maybe this isn't a surprise to any of us, but it's a really important piece to understanding the parable that came before it, the parable of the wicked tenants. The religious leaders, of course, rightly interpreted that this was a parable meant to refer to them. But it is also speaking to us, and we just have to dive a little deeper to see what it is saying. You see, tenants, like tenants today, are not owners. They do not have full control, but as a result, they also don't have full responsibility. The owner of this land, of the vineyard, just wanted his share, whether that be a percentage or a predetermined amount. The tenants would benefit from the higher quality work. But instead, they choose violence. And this violence actually escalates as the story goes on. The first slave that is sent is just merely sent away. The second is beaten. The third is killed. And then the son is sent. And he too is brutally murdered. Yes, this should make us uncomfortable. This is taking something to an extreme, but perhaps it is all too normal. We hear stories of this on the news, of violence escalating, seemingly from an almost innocent thing into something quite terrible. This may be showing the utter depravity of humanity or the allure of greed. Now, I don't believe that humans are inherently bad, but I do think we can get caught up in systems and patterns that are evil. Many have connected this vineyard in the passage we heard to the vineyard that is found in Isaiah 5, where God is said to have planted a vineyard that was meant to produce the finest grapes. But these grapes did not live up to what they were meant to be. What would it look like instead if we think of how these grapes, how these icons and name-bearing tenants were supposed to look? I think it's more than just paying their dues and paying their taxes. It's more than just not abusing and not killing. Anyone who gardens knows that the time and energy that we put into preparing the soil, into weeding and trimming and watering and feeding those plants will have a significant impact on the quality of fruit that grows. The tenants not only occupy the space, but are responsible for the fruit their effort bears. Now, sometimes I get some pushback because I often lean into ideas that are often tied with social justice or speaking truth to power. Some will complain that this is a distraction from God's work. But then I point them to passages like this one. Justice and equity has been a part of what God has been doing all along. If we give up our responsibility to care for the world and to seek justice for all, are we not like these wicked tenants? How long will it be before we are so numb to injustice that we start committing injustice ourselves? Now, I'll be honest. I get overwhelmed when I look at all the terrible things that are happening in our world. We are in an age where we are more informed than anyone else has ever been in the history of humanity. And yet, the amount of influence we have on the world around us and on the information we receive is about the same. We have a limited scope of what we can do. And so when I feel overwhelmed by all the things that are going on in the world that bring us down, I try to stop myself and look at what I can do in the world around me, thinking about what is my circle of influence, what is my vineyard to tend. As we go into our time of reflection, I invite you to think about what that means for you. Now, sometimes it's really easy to take the questions that are in the study that we have laid out for us and shoehorn them into what we've been speaking about. I struggled with that a little bit this week, so I decided I would just add a little asterisk, a little fine print at the bottom, instead of necessarily just thinking about what we own, but what God has entrusted us with. If we are the tenants, we may not own, but we have been entrusted with what we have. Thinking about what we own, not just as things that are for us, but as a portion of what God has given us for the world and for the people in it. Take a few minutes to think about this, to meditate and see what emerges in you. After that reflection time, we will also be taking communion together. See if those two things go together for you in any way. I love bringing two random seeming things together and see what happens. So take a few moments of silent reflection, and then we will return for communion.